Okay, it's a great pleasure to welcome Kasia Boddy to Nottingham today. Kasia is a lecturer at Cambridge University and a distinguished member of the American Studies community in Britain, I think, for a long time, and previously worked at University College London. I think Kasia has a refreshingly eclectic range of research interests. I think that's the best way of putting it.
Dilettante.
That's good. We need more of those, I think. A long-standing interest in the American short story. She's written about American adolescence, and more recently an award-winning book about the cultural history of boxing, which attracted glowing press reviews. Her most recent book was about an entirely different subject, the geranium, and in this book Kasia explores the changing image of this plant as portrayed in painting, literature, film and popular culture worldwide. And I think in today's talk Kasia is going to be talking about a subject which we might call another hardy perennial, which is the great American novel. And more particularly she's going to talk about the persistence in American writing of novels that, as Henry James put it, have an eye for national types. Novels that imagine case studies of someone typical, who not only lives somewhere typical, but whose profession and lifestyle, thoughts and feelings represent and diagnose what we might call a national character. So I'll hand over to Kasia, and I think the format is that Kasia will give a talk, I'll give a short response, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everyone for coming on this lovely summer lunchtime, and I hope this isn't the last of the summer and that you've wasted these hours when it starts raining at 3 o'clock or something. And I apologise that if I was talking about geraniums, you'd have a much more exciting PowerPoint than you will today. So most of the images on the PowerPoint are actually going to just be the passages that are also on the handout. And I hope if everyone's got one, if you haven't, there's a few left. But okay, everyone has. Okay, well, I'm going to start with a quotation that some of you may be familiar with. It's now quite often quoted from the 2006 issue of the New York Times. The Times Book Review had conducted a survey in which, and this is number 1 on the handout as well, had conducted a survey in which a group of luminaries were asked to name what they called the single best work of American fiction published in the last 25 years. And these are the results here, if everyone can see them. I'm not going to read them out or particularly discuss them. But to ask for the best work of American fiction, observed the journalist A.O. Scott, looking at these novels, he said, is not simply to ask for the most beautifully written or the most enjoyable to read. Rather, he says, the best works of fiction, according to our tally, appear to be those that successfully assume a burden of cultural importance. They attempt not just the exploration of particular imaginary people and places, but also the illumination of epochs, communities, of the nation itself. America is not only their setting, but also their subject. And that last line, America is not only their setting, but also their subject, might seem an unproblematic definition of the way in which fiction might be thought to represent a nation, a combination of, in his terms, exploration and illumination, or we might say description and interpretation, or mimesis and meaning. But it begs many questions about how this might be achieved. What, in other words, is the relationship between representation, and this is from Webster's dictionary now, representation, a word used in literary or art criticism to describe an artistic likeness or image, and representation used in that legal or political discourse to reference the action of one person or a fact of one person standing for another so as to have the rights and obligations of the person represented. What particularly imaginary people and places, to come back to Scott's term, can be best made to assume, what he says, the burden of cultural importance. And these are the questions that I'm trying to address in my work now, my research, on what since the 1860s has, for better or worse, been called the Great American Novel. And on the handout number 2, and here is, I won't discuss it yet, I'll come back to it, a single tale which paints American life so broadly, truly, and sympathetically that every American of feeling and culture is forced to acknowledge the picture as a likeness, that word again, of something which he knows. And I'll come back to this definition and its author in a moment. But first I'd like to make it clear that by looking at big books that usually by virtue of their bulk as well as their scope have claimed cultural importance in the United States over the last 150 years, I'm not arguing for the Americanness of a particular style or structure or subject matter. For one thing, the novelists themselves have consistently looked to foreign models for their work of national interrogation. The first plea here for the Great American Novel was for a realist with the scope of Balzac or Mazzoni, whereas Frank Norris and Upton Sinclair a little later openly emulated a now little known trilogy by the Polish writer Sienkiewicz about national literature. John Dos Passos, whose USA many of you may be familiar with, drew on, among many other things, Thackeray's Vanity Fair, Eisenstein's cinematic montage, and Barocca's Madrid trilogy. And the list, I could basically spend an hour giving you a list like that. Okay. I'd also suggest that a firm division between what's sometimes called the sealed container of the national and the free-ranging transnational novel is hard to establish. Since the Pequod took to the seas in Moby Dick, the Great American Novel, which I'll call after Henry James the Gan to save time, the Gan's interest in the mechanisms and consequences of international capitalism has hardly faltered. However politically appealing it might be to imagine what one essay calls the worlding of the American novel, and to point out a new interest in the crossing of borders, the fact that remains, I think, also that the subject of many recent novels published in the United States is not so much the world as the United States in the world. On the whole, then, while great American novelists from Jonathan Franzen back to somebody like Frank Norris are happy to acknowledge that, as Norris says, there's a vast world-wide flowing that bore down upon Chicago, Chicago, rather than the vast world, remains their subject. And again, this could be another paper. I'm just putting that in as a kind of proviso. So my focus today then is on the processes by which, to go back to Scott, by which particularly imaginary people and places have assumed cultural representativeness. And the first question I suppose I want to raise in relation to this is, how many people? 1,000 people? 100? 10? Or would one do? Is there really, as novelist Thomas Wolfe posited in 1930, a native who has the whole consciousness of his people and nation in him? What might that mean? In 1891, by which time swathes of novels, including his own, had been judged according to the criteria of the Great American Novel, the novelist and magazine editor William Dean Howells argued, and this is number 3 on the sheet, and this is Howells, argued in a review of H.H. Boysen's The Mammon of Unrighteousness that instead of trying to find one novel by one novelist, for he said, how could a single tale get America all in, what the nation needed was what he called a force of novelists, proportioned upon the basis of our congressional representation. Since each locality, to use a term that Howells often used, was so distinct, each locality was so distinct, the United States novel, he said elsewhere, could only be possible when some genius is born all over the Union. In other words, never. Nobody can be born in more than one place. Howells' solution then to the issue of the Great American Novel, which many late 19th century writers really thought was an issue, the production then of a library or a congress of novels, simply, however, altered the frame of reference, moving the problem of the issue of representation and representativeness to a kind of lower level. In other words, while Howells thought the idea of a single representative American to be problematic, he saw no difficulty in the notion of a typical Oklahoman or an exemplary Californian. And indeed, many writers following the logic of this felt if they could squeeze in enough local types, and again we might ask how many is enough, into a single novel, then they would have in fact achieved a kind of single volume Congress, or the Great American Novel. And the year before he talked about this idea of kind of a proportional representation requiring a library, Howells himself attempted his own single volume version of Literary Democracy, a novel called A Hazard of New Fortunes, which was serialized here as well. And the novel works to create a series of American microcosms on the same model, in some ways, as the American Congress. First of all, it's set in New York, a city that is not local, the novel insists, but belongs to the whole country. A microcosm that's still further miniaturized in its tenements. He talks about large old mansions divided into 5 or 6 dwellings, and particularly in a restaurant where he says you can find all nationalities, and where it's like cutting straight down through a fruitcake or a mince pie. You don't know who made the pie, you get a little of everything. But the setting in which Howells most literally and elaborately presents his ideal of a kind of force of writers, he says working under one editorial direction, to come back to that phrase there, is in the offices of a magazine called Every Other Week, the staff and contributors of which are also geographically and socially diverse, brought together, he says, by crazy fortuities. And the editor of the magazine, the novel's protagonist, Basil March, is like Howells, a transplanted Ohioan, and everyone he meets is either from another part of the country or another part of the world. The magazine's contributors include a Mississippian who writes articles suggesting how the commercial poison at the heart of our national life might be corrected by reintroducing a modified version of slavery, and a German-born kind of socialist anarchist who's lost an arm fighting for the Union during the Civil War. March himself, by his admission a sentimentalist, is fond of all these people and excited to think that their voices will be heard, he says, in the magazine's circulation from ocean to ocean. Moreover, the magazine is designed to develop this along cooperative lines, with profits shared among all the contributors. Every Other Week, in other words, seems destined to enact Howells' dream of, in his phrase, democracy in literature, a republic of letters in which all men are free and equal. But from the start, from its very conception, this vision of cosmopolitan class harmony is complicated by the fact that the magazine is bankrolled by an Indiana plutocrat who's come to New York because an even bigger corporate plutocrat, Standard Oil, has forced him to sell his oil fields. The crisis of the novel occurs when March is forced to acknowledge that democracy is not working either in the city, in the heart of New York. He says a new civil war is being fought between workers and the police, or in the offices of the magazine, whose backer is revealed to be a tyrant, as well as, in the magazine language, an angel, a backer. And most critically, March is forced to acknowledge that he himself is a mere employee, rather than someone under whose direction journalistic democracy can flourish. But Howells doesn't, to many readers' kind of complaint, Howells doesn't allow this bleak realization to end his novel. In a final twist, March becomes the owner of the magazine, thus re-establishing the Republic of Letters with what, as I said, some readers have felt is too much ease. Few, if any, really, other novels have taken the editorial offices of the magazine as the literary equivalent of Congress. Many, of course, adopt some other kind of microcosm: the ship's crew, the sports team, the army platoon. 7 years after F.O. Matheson published American Renaissance, his hugely influential reading of Melville's Moby Dick as an allegory of the struggle It's published in 1941, an allegory of the struggle between totalitarian forces of Ahab and democracy, the crew of diverse isolatos federated along one keel. So 7 years after that, Norman Mailer, one of his deeply impressed Harvard students, completed his first novel. And in Mailer's war novel, published in 1948, the federated crew of the Pequod become members of a reconnaissance platoon, featuring a Brooklyn Jew, a Boston Irishman, a Swedish immigrant son, a Mississippi sharecropper, a second-generation Italian, a Polak from Chicago, and so on. And some years later, Oliver Stone in Platoon reworks the trope and relocates it to Vietnam. It's a film very much in debt to Mailer and to Melville. And it's not only the boys who look for microcosms. In 2006, when Lynn Tillman, who is less well known, when she wanted to write a novel, she said, about being American now, the novel that became American Genius, a comedy, which I sort of warmly recommend, her immediate problem was where to locate, she said, her microcosm of American society. And she finally settled on a kind of artist's colony cum sanatorium in New England, a kind of update of de Crevecoeur's Great American Asylum. And Tillman couldn't be more different from Mailer. Both, however, produce national fantasies, to use Lauren Berlant's term, that nod to Moby Dick. Okay, well, I want to now kind of return now to Howells and to his review of the Mammon of Unrighteousness by the now completely, I think, unread Norwegian-born novelist H.S. Poulsen. After acknowledging that America cannot be got into a single novel and that we need this congress of books, Howells goes on to argue that in the meantime, he says, the Mammon of Unrighteousness may stand for an American novel of the first rank. Why? Well, because the Mammon of Unrighteousness, he says, is just to both sides of the national character. No people ever presented as we do the beauty of the idea and the ugliness of the material. I think it must be ideal, not idea, but anyway, that's a typo. In other words, Howells, known today and celebrated today as a great champion of American realism, sees no problem in its alliance with allegory. Poulsen, too, is unapologetic about his commitment to type, although he himself is also stressing himself as a realist. But he takes a phrase from the New Testament for the title of his novel, from Luke, and he uses a biblical story of two brothers at war to represent what Howells argues as the warring fact of our civilization. But Howells goes on in his review to say that these types are also characters, and it is with their fortunes as living men that the novel mainly concerns itself. In other words, don't worry, this isn't pure allegory, this is a realist novel, these are living men. And I spoke a moment ago about this series of novels that adopt and adapt the image of the kind of federated keel, suggesting how disparate characters come together to represent some kind of American microcosm. Such works acknowledge that kind of national collectivity is made up and provisional. Imagined communities, a famous phrase, sustained by considerable effort and liable, like Basil March's magazine or Oliver Stone's Platoon, to fall apart at any moment. On this model, the great American novel is exemplary of what Lukács, and this is also in the handout, imagined the novel more generally to be, a kind of debased epic, that's one that still thinks in terms of totality, but which can only achieve that totality through manufactured connections that he says are abolished again and again. And what I would suggest with novels like this, and another one that I'm going to talk about in more detail, is that what the presence of allegory does often is to naturalize that process of kind of manufactured connection. and suggest its permanence. So political and ideological alliances are compared to the relationship between siblings here, or particular aspects of national character compared with relationships between siblings or cousins, or especially in the fiction immediately following the Civil War, in the Reconstruction period, to a marriage, to a new relation freed from the burden of the past, a relation that's imagined to be permanent, but one that doesn't have these past quarrels. So I'm now going to go back to the man who doesn't necessarily invent the phrase "the great American novel," but formulates it, John W. DeForest, a former Union Army officer and author of many novels. And he first formulates this definition that I gave you a moment ago, and I won't kind of go through it again, but just to say that in some ways his article, published in 1868, is a kind of advertisement for himself, because the year before he'd published his own version of the great American novel, which uses the marriage plot to suggest a kind of national unity. And that novel is called Miss Ravenel's Conversion from Secession to Loyalty, which is kind of periodically reprinted. There was a Penguin Classic a few years ago. It's probably gone out of print again now. As its title suggests, the novel offers an allegory of reconciliation between North and South. Like John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, from this world to that which is to come, DeForest's novel presents a journey through humiliation, doubt, despair, destruction and wantonness towards what he sees as a celestial city. Page 1 confirms the allegorical intention, presenting the interesting juxtaposition of a Miss Lily Ravenel of New Orleans and Mr. Edward Colburn of New Boston, a stand-in for DeForest's native New Haven. And when Lily is persuaded by the Republican cause after only a few chapters, it takes nearly the whole novel for her to come round to the idea of Edward as a husband. But DeForest ends with Edward and Lily setting up home, and Lily complaining like a proper Yankee housewife about how dreadful the prices are. And I've put a little extract of it on the sheet. But the charmingly profligate southern girl has clearly gone for good. The story is about how she is transformed, she is converted. The plot, as Henry James pointed out in his review, is of the simplest, and the allegorical personification equally so. But without my going into it, Howells also described the novel as realist before realism was named. Particularly its battle scenes were highly praised. So again, allegory and realism are kind of sitting happily together. And that combination of realism and allegory, of documentation plus classification, exploring, then illuminating, to come back to Scott's terms, is, I'm arguing, fundamental to the great American novel. Not only to the great American novel, but certainly to the great American novel. In other words, its imaginary people must always be types as well as characters, although those types are seldom are so rarely as easy to identify or as stable as in DeForest's novel. As Millicent Bell and others have shown, Henry James repeatedly interrogated the tension between what Susan Manning, in her, I've just put up the cover, in a posthumously published study of the 18th and 19th century transatlantic poetics of character, what Susan Manning describes as national and personal embodiment, in a way between type and character in Howells's terms. And this is something I think can be thought of in relation to James. In 1877, James published a novel called The American, whose protagonist had the blatantly allegorical name of Christopher Newman, but was very different from de Crèvecoeur's 18th century version of the Un-American, this new man that you may be reading about, Farmer James. In 1878, James published his study of Daisy Miller, which is all about, and again I'm not going to talk much about it, all about the kind of reductiveness, the dangerous reductiveness of typecasting. So classification of various kinds, including national character, not only, but including national character, is a compulsive habit for many of James's characters. For example, in the Bostonians, here Olive Chancellor is quick to claim Verena Tarrant as a flower of the great democracy, while in the Portrait of a Lady, Isabel Archer declares Henrietta Stackpole a kind of emanation of the great democracy. I don't say she sums it all up, that would be too much to ask of her, but she suggests it, she vividly figures it. For Millicent Bell, James's novels reveal classification, typology, to be treacherous as well as useful. But I perhaps reverse the phrase. Classification is not only dangerous, it's also necessary, inevitable, even if also inevitably always flawed and partial. For a flower of the great democracy is too definite a description of Verena Tarrant, too much a kind of slogan of the lecture agent or the journalist. Equally unsatisfying is the notion proposed by her father, Mr. Tarrant, that his daughter Verena is quite unique, or as Basil says, in a category of her own. And Basil likes himself to think of himself as also, he says, apart and unique. But that's not quite how James thinks of either of them, I would suggest. The Bostonians, which James described as a very American tale, an attempt, he said, to show that I can write an American story, interrogates rather than dismisses types, and in some ways it can also be read as a kind of rewriting of Miss Ravenel's Conversion, or the sectional romance, sectional reconciliation romance more generally. And certainly the Bostonians begins in familiar territory with the antagonism of a Confederate and a Union veteran. But here the genders are reversed. The Mississippian Basil Ransom is dark, deep and glowing, he's described, an offshoot of the old slave-holding oligarchy with something almost African in his tone. So he's a slaveholder, but he has something African in him too. The Bostonian Olive Chancellor is colourless, progressive, lesbian, and the sister of two brothers who died for the Union. Not only does their rivalry for the affections of Verena Tarrant replay the rivalry for Lily Ravenel in DeForest's novel, but throughout the Bostonians the language of sectional reconciliation is evoked and subverted. Verena, for example, speaks eloquently about a future in which the enmity between men and women would disappear, she says, in favour of an intimate and equal union. While Miss Birdseye, an ancient abolitionist, hopes that Verena and Basil will form the closest of all unions. His being a southerner, she says, giving a point to the whole thing. But what is the point? What is James's point? Union is mentioned again in the novel's final sentence, but this time the narrator insists that it will be far from brilliant, and the continuation rather than the end of tears. In DeForest's novel, the united Lily and Edward Colburn settle into the quiet haven, we're told, of the family homestead in Connecticut, a celestial city of industriousness. In James's novels, the Ransoms will have to make with two shabby rooms in a somewhat decayed mansion on the corner of New York's 2nd Avenue. So is this the new national home? What is the allegory here? Allegories of national character in 20th century fiction also tend to see types in terms of a kind of complex interaction between many factors: ethnicity, gender, place, profession, ideology, and so on. These definitions proliferate. And often, as in James, the aim is less to do, though, with national types than to undermine their stability, to make them more complex. In other words, the story is often of evoking the national type to go against other kinds of typecasting. Consider the case of Gertrude Stein. In 1903, Stein began writing The Making of Americans, but then abandoned the project for several years because, as she explained in a letter to a friend, "I'm afraid that I can never write the great American novel. I don't know how to sell on a margin or do anything with shorts and longs. So I have to content myself with niggers and servant girls and the foreign population generally." And she's talking about her modestly named collection, 3 Lives, suggesting that niggers and servant girls and the foreign population somehow belong to that kind of modest short story rather than the national epic. 20 years later, though, her 925-page, essentially American, as she put it, book about the foreign population was published, the title referring both to the making of a nation through immigration, the old people in a new world, the new people made out of the old, that is the story I mean to tell, she says, and to the making of their story out of language. And the subtitle of the book is a history of a family's progress. And Stein very deliberately provokes her readers to think about notions of history and progress and how those work. And how those work to create and undermine type. The Making American was one of many novels in the 20th century which, from diverse points of view, rejected a marginal position to assume whole nation spokesmanship. And I'm not going to talk about any of these in detail. I Am an American, of course, Augie March, initials AM, declares at the start of Saul Bellow's 1953 novel, The Adventures of Augie March. And at the novel's end, he refers to himself as a sort of Columbus of those near at hand, rather. And the book's final word is America. And one reviewer complained about this book as, Bellow is aiming too directly at the idea of the great American novel. He's trying too hard. And something we can maybe talk about later is the way in which these openings and endings, and names and so on, do this allegorical work, lift some other kind of story into this realm. I Am an Invisible Man begins Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man from 1952, which doesn't sound promising, but when he concludes his story by asking, "Who knows but that on the lower frequencies I speak for you," we know that he means, I am an American too. Bellow was Jewish from Chicago. Ellison was black, living in New York. Each was keen to assert, and they did so repeatedly in their essays, correspondence, and so on, that they spoke not simply as a Jewish writer or a black writer or a New York writer or a Chicago writer. So reacting against one kind of typecasting, that of the minority, they assumed another. They spoke for you. And as the Italian-American Don DeLillo updated it in Underworld, in your voice American. A comparable writing against expectations informs all sorts of works. From Willa Cather's My Antonia, in which a Virginian man, and again the Virginian, the American type, finds the meaning of the country, he says, in a bohemian girl living in Nebraska. What does it mean to find her, to say that she is a type? And Cather is not completely on her narrator's side in this. Or to Richard Wright's Book of the Month Club bestseller, which locates a black native son in the south side of Chicago. To Wall Street, where Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho works, or to the Baltimore Project in David Simon's visual novel The Wire, where a gay thief called Omar Little declares himself the American dream. Omar Little, the owner of another allegorical name, Life Short, Short Life, was President Obama's favorite character in the show. In other words, these examples, I suggest, show that Edith Wharton was wrong when she claimed, she said, that, and this is on your handout, that the great American novel must always be about Main Street, geographically, socially, and intellectually. For every Sinclair Lewis, who introduced his 1920 novel Main Street by declaring that Gopher Prairie, Minnesota is America, and who thought the eponymous hero of Babbitt, 1921, was the average, capable American. So for every Sinclair Lewis, then, we find a William Carlos Williams debunking both the notion of averageness and the kind of the epic ambition of the great American novel. So he writes a slim novella, which he entitles The Great American Novel, whose hero is a little Ford car. He says, she was very passionate, a hot little baby, and she falls in love with a Mack truck. So what kind of American types are these? And this is not to say that ordinary or average or attempts at the ordinary or average type don't exist in fiction and aren't worth considering. And if there was more time, I would kind of pursue Babbitt's descendants, including Rabbit, Angstrom, John Updike's Ticket, he said, ticket to the America all around me, or Richard Ford's Frank Bascom, who describes himself as an arch ordinary American who, like Babbitt, is employed in the true American profession of selling real estate. So I've sort of ranged around quite a lot, and in the time remains, I'd like to kind of stop doing that and consider a single novel, and perhaps introduce it to you as it's not very well known. A novel that I think offers a particularly interesting take on the uses and treacheries of type. And this is Laurie Siegel's Her First American, which was published in 1985, and which is in a tradition of skeptical immigrant fictions that reject the kind of linear metamorphosis from alien to American that has structured many of the kind of classic turn of the century works, such as, come back to this, but such as Abraham Cahan's novella Jekyll, for example, which charts the eponymous hero's metamorphosis into Jake, an American fellow, a Yankee, or Mary Anton's The Promised Land, which offers a kind of detailed classic account of what she says as an initiation into American ways, learning American English, acquiring American clothes, writing a poem for George Washington's birthday. We hail our Washington. In these works, in other words, the adjective American describes something stable and fixed. And the immigrant needs to work hard, not simply, as Anton puts it, to pass as an American among Americans by changing your name from Mariasha to Mary, say, but to truly become, she says, the youngest of America's children. And the bit I put on your handout, I was born, I have lived, and I have been made over, Anton says. An experience like that of Miss Ravenel moving from New Orleans to Connecticut, an experience akin to religious conversion. And the difference, I think, between Anton and Siegel can be summed up in the gap between the titles of their memoirs. In Anton's case, The Promised Land, and Siegel's Other People's Houses. Laura Siegel never converted, I would suggest, either in England, where she went as a child fleeing the Austrian Anschluss, nor, I'll suggest, in America. Siegel once described this book from 1964, Other People's Houses, as the work of an unwilling anthropologist. It details her life in a series of foster families, 5 and 8 years, an experience that exposed her at a very young age to a wide range of social and geographical situations. An experience which, in order to survive, she translated, she said, from "isn't this intolerable" to "isn't this interesting?" And one of the most interesting things she observes and comically queries throughout that memoir is the desire to classify. For example, the labeling of her parents as aliens of hostile origins, or the contest she describes between the Jewish Committee, which saved me from Vienna, and the Church Refuge Committee, which had the care of my bodily needs in England. Each strove for my soul, she says, she wryly observes rather, without much passion. And I think to a great extent, Siegel, who at the age of 85 is still writing, has just published, she publishes a novel about every 10 years, and she's retained a sense of kind of detached and ethnographical perspective, especially towards what she sometimes calls real America. And I'll say a bit more about that, what she means by that in a moment. But the other key word to note, I think, in this self-description is the self-description as unwilling anthropologist is unwilling. At the same time as she finds herself viewing others in a rather distant and sceptical way, Siegel acknowledges that she'd much rather make some other kind of affiliation. Whether her characters are in a small English town here, or in the Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan, or an academic think tank in New England, or in her most recent novel in a geriatric hospital, they're always trying to carve out some space that they can call home and find some people that they can call family or friend. So the question of affiliation is one that she takes seriously. And cousin is a word that particularly interests Siegel. In a note prefacing her story collection, Shakespeare's Kitchen, which I'll talk about in a moment, she argues that Goethe's phrase, Wahlverwandtschaften, should be translated as elective cousins, the cousins we choose. How do we meet, she says, people we don't know? How do acquaintances become intimates? And conversely, how do intimates become acquaintances again? Less than strangers, because they can never be future intimates. So one of the stories in that collection, Shakespeare's Kitchen, is called An Absence of Cousins. And it features Siegel's recurrent alter ego, Ilka, always asking people how they had met. Ilka, like a Viennese refugee in New York, has got a job at a university in the small town of Concordance in Connecticut. Her friends assure her rather unconvincingly that she's finally getting a chance to discover the real America. And that word keeps coming up, this phrase, real America. But feeling that she's emigrating again, Ilka sees simply further confrontations with other people's doors, other people's bedrooms, other people's telephones, and courtesy of her New York friends, other people's telephone numbers. What a lot of people there are that one doesn't know, she said, as she goes through her list of acquaintances. And the story is full of sentences such as this. She was dialing the number of the woman who had dated the man whose name Ilka was never able to remember, so she was relieved when they didn't answer. Shakespeare's Kitchen, together, is a book of phone calls and letters. And it ends appropriately with a phone call from Ilka's daughter, asking if her mother had found a lost address book. No, Ilka tells her, I don't know anybody's address. In the course of the book, Ilka has lost her husband and her lover, her home, and also her makeshift home that she finds in the eponymous kitchen of Leslie and Eliza Shakespeare. These are losses that she treats with the detachment of an anthropologist. But finally, in the last page, Siegel allows her protagonist a moment of unwilling catharsis. And the book ends when Ilka realizes that she can't get in touch with a very minor character, not a close friend, a woman called Betsy. And realizing that she can't get hold of Betsy, we're told Ilka wept, she wept and wept. In her first American, the novel I want to just sort of finish with, Ilka is known as Ilka Weissnix. In Shakespeare's Kitchen, she's Ilka Weiss. On the one hand, as Siegel points out, she's highlighting the difference between autobiography and fiction. And she says, I'm using the method Kafka used with his cave. I don't want to pretend I'm creating a new character. The only character I know is my left rib, so let me face up to that. Ilka is Ilka, however, she's not the same Ilka. The difference is in the name, the classificatory mark, the typography in the mark. Ilka no longer knows nothing, as she translates Weissnix. She's now wise. The The trajectory from knowing nothing to wisdom is, of course, partly a trajectory of assimilation, and Ilka's name contains another clue to what that might entail. I think, but it also kind of queries that sense of moving from knowing nothing to wisdom. Her first American begins with Ilka newly arrived in Manhattan and immediately disappointed. Everyone she encounters on Broadway seems to be Viennese. She even recognizes the fabric on a woman's dress. The same cabbage roses, she says, bows and violins in my great Aunt Mally's Sunday dress. And she writes, those German pre-war cottons were like iron and had outlasted great Aunt Mally, as well as Ilka's father, 3 aunts, 4 uncles, and 2 of the cousins who used to gather for Aunt Mally's afternoon of Kaffee und Gugelhof. The Upper West Side, then, lacks both novelty, it's both too much like pre-war Vienna, and familiarity. It's not pre-war Vienna. For one thing, as she tells her cousin, by us in Vienna has nobody speaking Yiddish outside of the Poulsen. And so, like so many before her, Ilka decides to head west in search of the real America, that supposedly authentic place that is in fact a well-worn construct of cowboy movies and classic literature. Thinking of herself, in Thoreau's phrase, as a great Western pioneer, Ilka is delighted when the train stops in Cowtown, Nevada, the middle of the New World, and especially when she meets her first American, her first real American, that is. Ilka's American goes by the name of Carter Bayou, and as his name suggests, he couldn't be further from the expected Anglo-Saxon primitive that she's hoping to meet. Carter is described as a middle-aged, hard-drinking intellectual in her description. He's also black, the classifying mark of the key classifying mark of his social and political status, but something Ilka does not recognize until he tells her. So yes, he's an American, but also, as he adds, an American only of the second class. You and I stand here, Carter says to Ilka soon after they meet, but I don't know what the hell you're seeing. The patrons of the Nevada Cafe, however, see, and the narration goes, a very large, middle-aged, light-skinned Negro marching out of the door with a thin blonde following behind him. Identity, then, is a matter of perspective. Carter Bayou, who Vivian Gornick describes as one of the great creations in American literature, is based on the sociologist and writer Horace Caton. Caton, who studied with Robert Park at the University of Chicago, is best known for co-authoring Black Metropolis, and was a close friend of Richard Wright's. By the time Siegel got to know him, however, he'd largely abandoned academic scholarship and was working as a journalist. They didn't meet in a railroad bar in Nevada, but in a creative writing class at the New School for Social Research in Manhattan, and that difference is itself interesting. Other aspects of the portrait are much closer. Carter Bayou is perhaps partly named for the assonance of Carter and Caton, but also for the Carteret Hotel next door to the Chelsea Hotel on 23rd Street, where Clayton lived. Another example of how, in Siegel's phrase, the autobiographical travels and transforms in fiction. Here it doesn't travel very far, but yet even in that short distance it manages to become something closer to allegory or folk literature that Siegel translates and which he admires, she says, for telling the truth in the guise of a lie. Among other things, her first American kind of enacts a debate between the truths of sociology, autobiography, and fiction. And fiction, in some ways, is a kind of negotiation between the sociological and the autobiographical, I think. Between, again, allegory and realism. Caton devotes a chapter of his own autobiography, which I think I put Long Old Road, published in 1965, to his 2-year affair with Siegel. And as he tells it, the love affair consists largely of Fanon-esque or in a Frantz Fanon-esque conversations about at-homeness, sensitivity, and self-hate. A barbed conversation, he says, which intensifies when the couple join his old friends Brunetta and Sidney Bernstein, a black woman married to a Brooklyn Jew, and another interracial couple to spend a kind of summer in Connecticut. An interlude that occupies a large part of Siegel's book too. Caton reports that they all realized we were a group of marginal persons torn by different circumstances from our cultural milieu and bound together solely by the ties of our common alienation. But is their alienation really the same? Most reviewers of her first American have argued that Ilka comes to see herself, in the phrase, in Carter, that he is her mirror image. But while that's true, to some extent, I'd argue that the novel is much more self-aware than contemporary works such as Bernard Malamud's, or near-contemporary works such as Bernard Malamud's The Tenants from 1971, that uses encounters with African Americans to explore Jewish identity. Siegel goes beyond a kind of universalist affinity of strangers in a strange land to acknowledge the complex differences in their experiences and responses. In Caton's version of their relationship, Siegel is presented childishly competing in what Stanley Crouch in another context called the Big Time Martyrs rating contest. If we want to dig up old history, what about the slave ships? Interjects his friend Brunetta. But in her first American, Ilka is more sensitive. They have their own stories, she tells her mother. They don't need our nightmares. But it's not simply a question of parallel tracks of suffering. Carter has a image of that they move on parallel tracks. In other words, there will be no meeting except in affinity. But I think it also comes down once again to the fact that while Ilka may have an American, he's her first American, she doesn't see herself as one. While for Carter the problem is being an American of the second class. Caton fictionalized. I'm nearly finished there. Okay. It's okay. I don't want to count until. Caton, fictionalized as Carter Bay, appears 3 times in Siegel's fiction. In Shakespeare's Kitchen, he calls to say hello just moments after Ilka discovers her husband has been killed in a car crash. And to her horror, he can only say, "How embarrassing." He has 4 pages in her first book, the fictionalized memoir Other People's Houses, where he meets Laurie, as she's known there, at the new school and takes her out for dinner on a Thursday that turns out to be Thanksgiving. In this scene, the couple share no common alienation. Instead, Carter becomes very annoyed when she assumes he'll enjoy her snide remarks about greedy-looking Puritans killing red-faced turkeys. She may have nothing to celebrate, no Christmas because she's Jewish, no Jewish holidays because she was an assimilated Austrian, no Austrian holidays because, as she says, she was thrown out for being Jewish, and no American holiday because we haven't acquired them yet. But Carter insists that he is an American. At any rate, there's nothing else I am. I may order a French dinner and wine, which he's doing in this restaurant, rather than turkey, but I do it affectionately, like an American. But what is it to be like an American? The explanation that he offers moves from national to racial identity. I left the Negro world when I married a white wife, but I never married the white world. And then I divorced my wife. So is being like an American like being unmarried? Is being an American not having being in the white world or the black world? Ilka responds with her own comparison. That's like a Pakistani friend of mine. He lived in America for 11 years, and he's no longer an Oriental, and he's not an Occidental either. But Carter will have none of this comparison. It's not like that at all, he insists. Well, she thinks not having public celebrations is an emancipation to boast of, a kind of cosmopolitan rootlessness in a sense. He is moved by what he sees as her loss. Carter may be alienated or isolated, but even that isolation, he insists repeatedly, is peculiarly American. And so he feels well situated to offer Ilka, he says, an introductory course in Americana, albeit from the safety of New York, which, after all, as everyone in the novel insists, isn't real America, but a different country. So the complexities and absurdities of national identification here, about learning about national identification, recall the title of a lecture, and I'm just coming very soon to the end, that Siegel's parents attend when arriving in England. What is expected of the alien in a foreign country? What's the difference between alien and foreign? And so on. A colleague of Siegel suggested that her first American, the novel, is a kind of reverse Henry James. James introduces the simple American to the sophisticated European, and you do the opposite. You introduce a naive European to a sophisticated black American. Siegel certainly goes to some trouble to emphasize Ilka's naivety and poor English, both of which distinguish her from her creator, and Carter's urbane and cosmopolitan worldliness. When they meet, he's on the way to New York to act as an advisor to the United Nations. Ilka learns about politics and international politics, and as well as civil rights politics, as well as how to drink whiskey, jazz, sex, the names of American sandwiches. Most of all, from their very first drink together, when they have to leave the bar in a hurry in Nevada, he teaches her about this tacit protocols, which is his favorite word, protocol, of Jim Crow America. The novel depicts Carter as he slides into drink and depression, and as a countermove struggles repeatedly, and sometimes successfully, to, he says, re-establish protocol. Horace Caton concluded his autobiography by acknowledging he was sick, and by urging America to face up to the true measure of her own sickness, he said. In this, and in his borrowing of a famous phrase by another depressive alcoholic, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the crack-up, Caton was offering himself as a kind of representative man, an exemplary American, because a tragic figure. When Ilka first met Carter, on page 1 of the novel, she hid her smiling teeth inside her whiskey glass. In the final scene, she unlocked her teeth and opened her mouth. So her first American then is partly a Bildungsroman about finding a voice, about learning to use use English, a language that in other people's houses, she said, demanded that her jaw be reset. Ilka tells the young men that sorry, I've jumped ahead. Yeah. Did I miss a sentence? Yes, I think. So the novel ends with Ilka at a memorial for Carter, where he's being celebrated by his former graduate students as a black man among blacks. And at this point, Ilka opens her mouth and speaks, and she tells the young men that Carter had thought her name was a joke. Her classification, in other words, was a joke, meaning non-white, Weissnicks. Why does she interrupt their conversation, as the passage puts it, to say this, to make this joke? And I think because interruption of the tragic binary of black and white is what Siegel thinks Ilka can offer in this context. Interruption, a kind of recurring motif in the novel, as has been pointed out by Dean Franco, is not a quality of positive identification. It's not about thinking of oneself as Jewish, and Ilka certainly doesn't want to be thought of as a Jewish woman among Jews, nor is it about being, in Werner Soller's phrase, neither black nor white, yet both. Interrupting, what Siegel elsewhere calls being an argument causer, is an assertion here of the importance of a dialectical view of identity. Sorry. A saying of no to any single position of any stable classification. Or to put it another way, if, as Susan Manning argues in her book about 18th and 19th century character and nation and their permutations were formulated within a poetics of performance and comparison. Interruption, then, is a way of performing comparison here. It's a comic rather than a tragic performance, a serious if ineffectual, joke. And so her first American ends with a young black man turning to look at Ilka, acknowledging her remarks sympathetically and with kindness, but ultimately turning back into their circle and what they'd been going to say. But Ilka, as Carter Bayer might have said, she doesn't know what the hell they're seeing when they look at her, and she doesn't know what the hell she's seeing. But Ilka has moved on to her second America by this point. Trust a good book to overturn the expectations taught us by the bad book, Siegel once wrote, and trust one American type to overturn the expectations taught us by another. I'll finish that. Thank you.
Thanks, George.
Thanks,
Kasia. That was great, and I think there are lots of interesting issues there, particularly about race and ethnicity, which perhaps you can pick up in your questions. I've just got a few kind of quick points, maybe 3 points, I guess, which are about the way in which this sort of work that you're doing raises questions about how we work as critics of American literature, really, and how we approach our object of study. And the one thing that occurs to me really is that we might remain kind of trapped in quite a legacy of an old criticism, which is a kind of typological hermeneutics. So we've got a secularization of that whole process of type and anti-type. So rather than looking back to Old Testament and foreshadowing the New Testament, in a secularized American society, we're looking back at history or the past as the kind of type, and then thinking how that foreshadows 20th century or contemporary anti-types likewise. So we're kind of trapped in that kind of cycle, and I suppose at the bottom of that lies the question of American exceptionalism and the ideological thrust of exceptionalism and that kind of Puritan typology, I guess, errand in the wilderness and all that sort of discourse. And I suppose the question might be why, despite the transnational turn, that legacy doesn't appear to show signs of going away. So that's one point. The second point is really comes out of a conversation, not a oral conversation, but I was involved with a round table about a review of Frederick Jameson's new book, The Antinomies of Realism, and 5 of us wrote reviews, and Jameson responded in a very kind of idiosyncratic but really kind of provocative sort of way, and I've just got a sneak preview of this coming out in the Journal of American Studies at some point, and he makes some bold claims. He says America is not a nation state. It's a former settler colony which has become a superstate, and then he says this means that we have no national literature. Even though, and this is a quote again, we keep trying to have one, and the false question of what it means to be an American recurs historically again and again, at least since Emerson, like an allergy or a predisposition to this or that physical weakness. So that's one thing he says. And the other thing he says, which I think is interesting for us, because when we think about the great American novel, we tend to always to think about great and American, but often don't think about the novel. So what he says, his conclusion in this kind of piece, is that no American novel can compose the interesting, the fundamental form problems grappled with by Europeans and others. That seems to me quite a bold claim, that American writers don't do anything very radical or interesting with the novel form. And he says that so he calls the American writing a language experiment. It's constantly a language experiment. And the final point really is just about Lawrence Buell's new book, The Dream of the Great American Novel. And I wonder if we're in danger of maintaining a certain kind of insularity in our concentration on great and American, and not really thinking, like Jameson does, I guess. He's a comparatist critic who thinks about French and Russian, Spanish literature in that new book. And it seems to me that the conclusions that Buell draws seem to look nowhere else but America. So the conclusions the predictions he makes are that as long as the US remains a desirable location for immigrants, and particularly what he calls literary emigrants, and as long as New York remains the publishing centre of the world, then American experience will always be a key area of for a key subject for creative writers. He also says the novel is, this goes back to our kind of role as critics, the novel is institutionalised in the US more solidly than it has ever been. So the great American novel's unlikely to go away whilst we're still in the classroom talking about it. And then the final thing he says is that novelistic fashions will change. So people we think are great writers now will not be thought of in 40 years' time. And he's probably right, and we have to think about other kinds of issues that writers are grappling with that we don't recognise now. But none of that has anything to do with novelistic form for Buell. So Buell keeps America, I guess, rather than the novel at the forefront of his approach. So those are the kind of 3 quick points. I don't know if you just might want to respond to those, and then we'll open it up to questions.
I mean, I've been sort of working on this material for a while, and I was horrified to see that Buell's book, I kind of noticed that it was coming out beforehand, and that it was going to be a sort of 600-page, dealing with, he said, 600 novels or something, mentioned it. But I think I'm kind of on your side, and I hope that will become clearer, in that what I'm actually interested in is the novel part of that phrase much more. In a sense, I'm going to put it in, it's not so much what the novel can do for America as what America can do for the novel, for particular writers, and that actually what the sort of debates in the 1860s are often about, as well as about realism, and how the novel can compete with the newspaper, which I think is a kind of an ongoing kind of preoccupation. But there's a question of how fiction, particularly, can kind of assert its kind of cultural importance and find a kind of cultural space, so that engaging with nationalism, or in some ways engaging with a kind of global world, are, on that reading, to me, kind of both similar moves of aggrandizement that the novel encounters. So whether you see your story between these characters as reflecting in some ways about what it means to be an American, or whether it reflects on what it means to be a kind of global citizen, they're both ways of taking essentially a kind of popular form of entertainment, a story, and kind of bigging it up. And I think size, status, all these kind of words that make people, writers, kind of equivocal about the great American novel. They both want that status and sales figures, and that they're embarrassed because it is a kind of vulgar thing to admit. So, Jonathan Franzen, I should have brought a picture on the cover of Time magazine as great American novelist a few years ago. When Freedom comes out, why do you call your novel Freedom if you don't want to be on the cover of Time magazine under the title Great American Novelist? And then inside the magazine's an interview with him where he says, well, I don't like this phrase, especially when it's used in the wrong context by journalists. So, I mean, I think that there's a way in which, there's kind of having your cake and eating it with that concept among writers. But I think I don't think it's purely a critical issue, the kind of question of looking at types kind of coming out of a particular critical approach. I think that, in a sense, I think novelists often follow criticism, which is an interesting thing to keep in mind, partly because most novelists since the Second World War have gone to university and done courses in literature and American studies and so on. But also, and so perhaps novels will change in that way. But there is I think, a kind of persistence against in a way, against the critical trend for novelists in the United States to perhaps gesture towards a kind of comparative approach, but to keep bringing it back home. And I think sometimes there's an essay by Bruce Robbins which I mentioned, The Worldly of the American Novel, in the new Cambridge, or not new anymore, Cambridge History of the American Novel, in which he talks about, how much does the rest of the world get mentioned in order to provide a kind of setting for a dramatic or an American problem to be worked out. And I think so we might not like that to be the case, but we have to acknowledge in those books it is the case. I mean, I suppose your first point about typology and the kind of religious versus the secular typology is something that I perhaps should have said more about today, and would certainly want to think about more, because there's a way in which these sort of traditional modes of allegory and the Pilgrim's Progress being one of the bestsellers and most read books in the United States during the 19th century, its influence can't be kind of dismissed. But that's happening at the same time as the rise of kind of secular positivism, which is all about classification. And so DeForest is reading Bunyan and Balzac at the same time, and is interested in thinking about how different kinds of models of classification work. And I would argue, Sinclair Lewis can be thought of in relation to the rise of statistics and particular kind of sociological trends in the 1920s, Middletown, and being read alongside Main Street. So I don't think. I mean, I think there is a difference between the kind of biblical and the secular model, but they are kind of interwoven often. And in terms of I agree that in kind of Buell talks about in his book the idea of different scripts for the American novel, and what he does kind of downplay is the kind of internationalism of those scripts that writers do. And I sort of tried to mention a few of those at the beginning, that that there's a kind of irony in that people, and this isn't an exceptionalist thing for American writers. When British writers are trying to write their State of the Nation novel, they will also look to French novels or to American novels. That people, the models that you use and the kind of things you want to say are not necessarily the same. So you can be incredibly internationalist at the same moment that you're trying to say something about a nation. And I think often writers are.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Who wants to start us off? Gavin?
Thanks very much. I really, really enjoyed that. And I'm thinking about the subtitle to Caton's Black Metropolis, that it's a study of Negro life in a northern city.
Yes.
And that book is at once about Chicago and not about Chicago. It's mere sociological fact of writing experience with it. Yeah. And I'm wondering, you very compellingly argue for American types as effective rivet for reading character. Yeah. Can we use it to read plays? It can be expanded beyond that, and what would that look like?
Yeah.
Sorry, Cassie, do you want to stand up?
Sure. Well, I think you've given a very good example of that, and I suppose one of the things I'm interested in is how place changes. So the idea that Chicago as a kind of synecdoche of America was really, I suppose, for the first, I'm trying to think, first 30, 40 years of the 20th century. An interesting book or interesting kind of works to consider in relation to that is Dreiser's Cooperwood trilogy, which is much less well known than Sister Carrie, say, but it's a trilogy of desire, he calls it, about this kind of epic hero called Frank Cooperwood, who's a financier, and it starts off in Philadelphia and then moves to Chicago, and he very explicitly says that this is the center of America is moving from Philadelphia to Chicago, and then it kind of ends up in New York, and and Frank Norris is very interested in Chicago as well as a kind of as an epicenter or as the sort of representative town. Whereas Howells is thinking about the kind of move. He talks about, you know, Boston as being the center of the American kind of literary republic, and then what happens when that moves to New York. And whereas Sinclair Lewis is then thinking, well, actually, what about Minnesota? When we think of it in these terms. So I think people are interested in that. You know, Richard Ford, I mentioned Independence Day. It's set in New Jersey, the Garden State, and he again, I think, is quite conscious of thinking of using kind of slightly biblical imagery there, and thinking about what and using those kind of slogans as well into think of it. So certainly, I think that the question of place is used in terms of this kind of typing and anti-typing, and the Black Metropolis is a perfect example.
Thanks for the talk, which I really enjoyed, and I did see your paper as sort of going in one sense, and your project is going sort of hand in glove with Boyle's in more than one way,
yeah.
You know, and particularly in the sense that what I think you're both trying to do and doing successfully is sort of responding, talking back to the kind of deconstruction of the canon, and also the kind of the move towards transnationalism, and say there is something to be salvaged here in terms of what we need by national literature. And I think both of you do that very well. What I was sort of interested in what you said was, you know, like Buell in a way, you seem to be saying, to talk about this subject, we need to layer things against each other. You know, so you talked about Main Street and Middletown, for example, and that it's only in that layering we get to the idea of a kind of national novel or national consciousness or whatever you want to call it, which is multiple and fragmentary in all kinds of ways. But you know, in a sense, what you seem to be saying is that the national novel is there, but only in its absence in a peculiar kind of way, and that you were talking a lot about dialectics, about the relationship between alien and foreign and home, and in terms of the kind of fissures and fractures in national identity and what it means. And do you think that may be something that you're getting at? It's only in its absence that you can find that national novel. It's only in comparison that you can find something that leads towards a sense of identity and nationhood.
Yes, I mean, I suppose that that novels, the kind of form of the novel, is one that inevitably kind of brings about some kind of whole, and then the question is whether, in kind of using various novelistic structures, and I'm not sure about Jameson's point that there are no interesting ones used, you know, innovated by American writers. We can talk about that as a separate question. There is always a kind of question between the parts and the whole, and how you know the novel as a form is kind of by definition interested in relations of parts and wholes. But I mean, I suppose I'm slightly nervous about emphasizing kind of fragments or a kind of fracture, in the sense that it, you know, I don't want to kind of say that the kind of an American Adam kind of argument that it's always the maverick loner on the edge who is the true American, rather than the person at the center. I think it can be, but I think it's more fluid and more historically varied than perhaps that you know, at some points and in some novels it's about kind of fractured identity and always about kind of playing other identities. In other novels, I think it's kind of asserted in a much more unmarginal way, if I'm going to put it that way. I haven't really answered.
No, I suppose again I was thinking of what Graham was saying about American exceptionalism.
Yes, yeah.
Again, one of the things that Buell says, of course, is that what the novels we think of as great American novels do is actually to say what's wrong with America,
yes, absolutely,
rather than what's right with
yes,
America.
Absolutely.
And in terms of what you were then saying about that there are certain novels, and Augie March would be one of them, I suppose, where American identity is asserted in a more coherent way.
Yeah.
You know, what I suppose the logic of Buell's argument, and I think yours would be, is that yes, but you know there are all other different types of assertions of American identity, which can only be taken as valid when put together.
Yes, I suppose. I mean, the point about kind of what's wrong is something that I do find as interesting, because that does seem to be something that, for me, is a kind of shift from something like Miss Ravenel's Conversion, of the immediately post-Civil War novel, which is very much a kind of a hopeful, supposedly resolution to all kind of fissures and breaks, and by the time you get to the 1870s, immediately they're kind of turning that story on their head to show what's wrong and why it's not that, and that's what in Howells and James and many other writers. But they're kind of using that model in order to kind of subvert it. And I think the kind of Jeremiad is another form that we could talk about behind the great American novel often. I mean, an example that's quite interesting in this context is Philip Roth, who writes his own kind of, I would say, half tongue-in-cheek version of the great American novel in early 1970s, but in his essay about it talks very much about, you know, his position as diagnosing not just the problem with the country, but the problem with the country's myth-making. And yet, what does he do, you know, 30 years later, is he kind of engages, he kind of comes back to these issues and re-engages with that myth-making project. I mean, I think still undermining it in many ways. But I think that's a very kind of enduring, I think really since the end of the 19th century. Rationale for it, I guess I would put, you know, the rationale for writing this big book is that you're going to say what's wrong.
Any other questions? Yes.
So a quick question about place again.
Yes.
In your paper you talked about the inevitable influence of transatlantic literature.
Yes.
I was just wondering about novels, American novels, where part of the novel, or in fact perhaps the whole novel, is set in Paris.
Yes.
Does that location mean that the author in question is automatically taking themselves out of the category of great, and the American novel can't possibly be great if the location is transatlantic?
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, to me, and again, kind of come back to this question about how it's in some ways about the novel, or what the novel sees itself doing, is that the rhetoric of many novels that are set in Paris or other places is directed towards the United States, and isn't really about Paris, or isn't that concerned about Parisians or other characters, and is concerned with sort of enacting kind of debates, you know, and kind of in some ways positioning, the novelist is kind of positioning themselves in a kind of genealogy, and I suppose that's where it kind of comes back to the question of the novel as well, because it's and so the thing that I would emphasize, which is it's about the kind of aggrandizement of the novel as a kind of secular Jeremiad, if I want to put it that way, which is also about, and this is what Buell talks about, kind of establishing your position in a literary tradition, and so you know you're claiming your right to be considered alongside this whole genealogy of writers, or kind of canonical writers. So there's a kind of bigging up move there, by making your book a bit like Moby Dick, I mean, what more kind of aggrandizement can you get? But there's also, I think those things tend to be advertised much more strongly than, say, a novel's debt to various European sources or other sources, because that's not part of the kind of move in that way. If that makes sense.
Robert?
I've got a sort of historical question, which might touch on some of the implicit periodization in your paper.
Yes.
For me, it comes to a big shift around the early 20th century that you traced out right through to the present, really, in what the kind of great American novel was seen to be doing and what American types were necessary for its success.
Yeah.
And in your response to Graham's questions, you used the term state of the nation novel.
Yes.
And I just thought it's interesting to think about the extent to which that doesn't work as a kind of equivalent term for a great American novel.
Yeah.
I tend to associate it with a certain kind of 19th century novel. So I guess my question would be, what do you think, especially the examples you used to discuss, happens to the state of the nation novel in the American context in the 20th century?
I mean, I suppose it is a term that probably was used more earlier, although sometimes if you're reading reviews of some of the books I'm talking about, that phrase will come up. It was also used recently about a British novel a couple of years ago, John Lancashire's Capital, for example, which, again, the title, and I think it's thinking about kind of paratext, the way that you kind of move your novel from being a novel about a street and some people to being about capital because of certain, certain kind of moves that you can make in your novel. But I mean, I don't know if it's this phrase, the great American novel, that is partly to do with the fact that it's was so immediately mocked and yet so enduringly pursued. And really, if you can kind of looking at newspaper reviews and it right from the 1860s onwards, it never really goes out of fashion. In the sort of 1870s, almost every novel that's set in the United States is being assessed as a possible candidate for this, and the reviewer then kind of lists all the things that fall short, and that becomes the kind of standard way. And I suppose part of the thing I'm interested in is how periodically the debates, although I don't think it really ever goes away, periodically the kind of debates about having a state of a nation novel at all kind of come up, and at other moments in history, writers and the literary world is kind of less invested in that issue. And whether that's to do with, again, coming back to Graham's point about changes in the nation, or whether that's something to do with the kind of changes in literary culture through the period, I think is something to think about. And I'm tending to think it's more to do with literary culture than political culture or something.
Manson might be a good example.
Yeah.
He's best characterised, I'm thinking of Freedom, but also the Corrections.
Yeah.
As being a kind of state, having elements of that state of the nation.
Yeah.
Agenda.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not a great American novel.
Well, he's certainly thinking about, there's the ways in which he's sort of, and I had more time to talk about the way with Miss Ravenel's conversion is a kind of, as well as the civil war going on in that book, it also is a war between different kinds of communication. So it's fascinated with telegraphs, the telegraph system through the war and through newspaper reports of the war, and the kind of question, how does the novel compete with that in relation to realism? But what can it offer that the newspaper can't? It can emulate the newspaper in terms of putting facts in and giving you information, which we haven't talked about gender. We can come back to that. But it has to offer you something more than the ephemeral penny newspaper, and that's where I'm kind of suggesting is that whether we call it allegory, typography, interpretation, or Jeremiad or whatever, there's something kind of more than information that's being offered. Editorializing, and the editorializing in that, you know, this will give you a kind of a way of understanding all these disparate things. So that there's a kind of this tension between all these things and having to have a kind of explanatory guide, and that's what the types, I think, work as. Yeah.
Take a point in response to that. I mean, that needs to take into account the way that obviously newspaper reporting has evolved. But,
yes.
You know, long form journalism, reportage, and so on. And just a reflection really is the term Great American Novels cropped up recently in relation to one particular work that I've noticed in reviews, which was quite surprising because it's a work of non-fiction called The Unwinding.
Right. Oh yes, yeah.
And that basically takes all the, I think 4 ordinary people, I've got a copy but I've not actually started reading it.
Yeah.
It takes the experiences of 4 ordinary Americans over the last 30 years and throws in sort of Dos Passos style kind of newsreel type things or commentary on what's happening in 1994 and stuff. So that would be a very interesting kind of thing to explore in that context about. Given the fact that it won the National Book Award, it won some big award, you know, earlier this year. And it's very interesting. So many reviews mentioned that term. The Great American
All right, I'll look for that. Thank you.
So the Great American Novel is not a novel at all.
Non-fiction.
Non-fiction.
Well, I'm interested in. I mentioned very briefly The Wire, and which is in many ways, you know, David Simon talks about it as his visual novel or his televised novel, and he's thinking in quite literary terms at some point, as well as being a newspaper man and bringing that in. And I do think that there's, you know, it's not just kind of analogy to say, well, here are films that are trying to do the Great American Novel. Here's non-fiction. Here's kind of TV series. But because I think, you know, if we're thinking less in terms of kind of absolute generic definitions, but more in terms of kind of traditions of writing that influence other kinds of writing, then certainly if Dos Passos is kind of leading into The Unwinding, it's obviously with a kind of sense of trying to do something that, you know, Citizen Kane is also thinking about USA and so on.
Hacker is first and foremost a journalist, but he's also written novels as well.
Yeah. As long as he's read them, in a way it doesn't matter.
He's certainly read them.
He's certainly read them.
Rachel, did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, sort of adding on to that, because I study sort of novels that are being published right now, and it seems to me that the people who have less anxiety about sort of the death of the novel as a form are those who are more playful with genre and maybe sort of slip into non-fiction, and especially what you're saying about Siegel's sort of autobiographical detailing. And I wondered, with sort of that in mind, whether you see the death of the novels debates and the debates about the Great American Novel as sort of tangential, or whether they rise and fall at the same time.
It's interesting. I suppose it is that, you know, to come back to that first thing about kind of burden of cultural importance and what and how much. Where is it? This will be. Okay. And that in some ways writing experimentally doesn't have to be assuming a burden of cultural importance. I mean, that it can be, you know, the most innovative work can come out with small presses and you know, and be about issues that are not to do with kind of trying to intervene in some wider cultural debate. So so in some ways the health of the novel is not necessarily the same issue as the kind of as this. I'm sorry, I'm kind of skirting. I'm not really answering your question. I mean, I think that the question of how much novels are being, you know, the kind of conditions of publishing at different points is also an issue, and that if you think about now and the fact of there being these fewer and fewer publishing houses that are increasingly publishing a smaller number of books for a global market. What kinds of books are they going to look for in order to, what are the kind of books that we will be given, we will be exposed to, and they're not necessarily going to be books that are challenging and experimental. We will have to kind of struggle harder to get those books, I think. There is a way in which publishing, and this is something that Chad Harbach talks about, and that I don't know if some of you know, that new collection, MFA versus NYC, and he talks there about the New York novel as being almost kind of newsy, that it's, what are the kind of current issues, here's a kind of blockbuster in which you have your characters discussing, so it becomes a kind of extension of a magazine editorial piece in which you get your kind of pleasure through a story, but you also get your kind of New York Times editorials. To come back to the news question, I was looking a couple of years ago at John DeLillo's archives in Texas, and particularly the archives for the papers for Underworld, and I was quite shocked how much was the New York Times, clippings and clippings and clippings from the New York Times, or occasionally Time magazine, and it just felt like there are other things you could be reading. It's not that he wasn't reading other things, but it just felt there was so much, and he would, underlining words and phrases that were then, as it picked up in the novel. John Updike's Rabbit papers are also piles and piles of clippings from the New York Times. And
all the news that's fit to print.
No, but there's a way in which, you could say, is the great American novel just the New York Times with a love story attached to it, and I suppose that's partly what I'm thinking.
Yeah, thinking about Melba, for instance, he recycled no end of material, and had books open while he was writing. So there was lots of kind of recycling information. But
slightly wider reading, I suppose. It's
but kind of factual material.
Yeah, factual material. Yeah.
Narratives.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Two more questions. First, over here, and then.
I don't know. Maybe this is what you were saying, but it seems to me that there can never be a novel that is simply American. That all these novels you're talking about, or at least the ones I've read, are either about ethnicity, race, or region. And so in Augie March, if I remember this correctly, he says, I'm American, but
Chicago born,
yeah. And that's a big modifier.
Yes,
That tells you immediately that he's not a New Englander or Southerner or Westerner, etc. So I don't know, that's not really much of a question.
But the question, I suppose, is the relationship between those two parts of the sentence, and whether it's a modifier or whether it's saying I am American, but I can only speak from the Chicago point of view, or whether it's saying I'm from Chicago, but I'm speaking here as an American. And I suppose it's the relationship between those kind of spokesmanship issues that I think Bellow is saying I'm Chicago, but I'm going to be your guide to America. In a way.
One of the other things Jameson says is that when he says there's no national literature, America has quintessentially been the place of regional literature. And he says he doesn't feel that he has a regional identity. That's why he reads French and German and whatever. Hannah, last question.
I just had a quick question about identification, because you said just then about, is the great American novel just the New York Times with a love story? So to have a great American novel, does there need to be some kind of reader emotional connection and identification? Because I saw that you brought up the example of American Psycho.
Yes.
Where's the emotional connection? That's kind of a fascinating character portrait.
Yeah.
So there's no really emotional pull into it.
I suppose when I said love story, I didn't mean only love stories, or a crime story, or some other kind of genre story, and I think in that it's obviously the pull is the kind of incongruity. and the pool is the kind of story itself, and so on. But in terms of thinking about why Ellis calls it American Psycho rather than just Psycho or Wall Street Psycho or something like that, is how do we sort of take our interest in the story and kind of try and extrapolate something else from it, I suppose. That's what. It is a difficult one to identify with.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Kasia. Great
Thank you.
talking about questions.